Part 1. Clovis First. If you've learned about Native American history at school at any point in the last century, then you have probably been taught the Clovis First theory of how they crossed into the Americas. The idea was that during the last ice age, a dramatic fall in sea levels created a 55-mile land bridge in the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska. The concept of a land bridge joining Asia and the Americas had been around since the late 16th century, when the Spanish priest, Joseph de Acosta, admitted that it was unlikely the Native Americans had arrived on a second Noah's Ark, by being carried there by angels, or by travelling from Atlantis, and decided that they had probably arrived by land somewhere in the then unmapped north. It was only in 1937 that Swedish botanist Eric Holton coined the term Burundia to refer to the area in and around the Bering Strait land bridge, but by then the idea of it being the path the Paleo-Americans had taken to the continent wasn't new. In 1964, a scientist called Clovis Haynes discovered the existence of an ice-free corridor, which emerged after the separation of the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets about 13,000 years ago. This meant it was around at about the same time as the Bering Strait land bridge. This discovery was added to the end of the initial theory, and the scenario of the Paleo-Americans walking straight across the Bering Strait land bridge into Alaska and then marching down an ice-free corridor to get to the more habitable lands in the south became widely accepted for the next 3 or so decades. It did, after all, make quite a lot of sense, especially due to the fact that the earliest culture to be found in the Americans at the time, the Clovis culture, seemed to have emerged just after the ice-free corridor had formed. This evidence supported the theory so much that it became known as the Clovis First theory, and it seemed pretty watertight. Or at least it did until 1997, when it was rocked by the discovery of human occupants in Monteverde, an archaeological site in the south of Chile, 8,000 miles from Burundian. Monteverde had been known about since the 70s, but it was only in 1997 that a team of 12 highly respected archaeologists visited it and confirmed that evidence suggesting human occupation 14,500 years ago, predating both the Clovis culture and the ice-free corridor by 1,000 years, did in fact seem sound. Since then, it has been discovered that humans lived in Monteverde too between 18,500 and 14,500 years ago, and another site nearby, Monteverde 1, seems to suggest the possibility of human occupation as much as 33,000 years ago, which, if true, would really rock the archaeological boat, but too little evidence has been discovered of that so far. Whatever the case, it had become clear by 1997 that the once widely accepted Clovis First theory no longer had a strong consensus, and other theories were soon championed, some of which had clearly been carefully considered by experts, whilst others had been thrown together by a team of monkeys with typewriters. Which brings us on to Part 2, the Solutrean Hypothesis. The Solutrean Hypothesis theorizes that the earliest human migration into the Americas was actually European rather than Asian in origin. The Solutreans were a group of Europeans who lived in Spain, France, and Portugal between 22,000 and 17,000 years ago. The idea is that at some point during the last glacial maximum, the Solutreans hopped on boats and crossed the North Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, stopping to fish on pack ice as they went. The theory was suggested because of the similar ways in which the Solutreans and the Clovis cultures produced stone tools, and supporters of the hypothesis also pointed to the strong presence of haplogroup X in both Anatolian and Northeast American populations. However, most archaeologists now agree that the hypothesis doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It is entirely possible that both the Solutrean and Clovis peoples could have come to use similar techniques in stone tool production independently of each other. It had happened before. Platinum was discovered by both Antonio de Ulloa and Charles Wood in the 1740s, with both being unaware of each other's discoveries, and the phenomenon of 2 or more people discovering or inventing the same concept or technology at around the same time, separately of each other, happens so often that there's a whole theory as to why it happens, called recombinant conceptualization. So, the 5,000-year gap between the Solutreans and the Clovis cultures, as well as the huge ocean between them, made chance a more likely explanation for similar production methods than a 5,000-year trip across the ocean, followed by a hike to southern North America. The genetics argument was harder to resolve and requires a little more background knowledge. A haplogroup is a genetic marker inherited through your direct maternal or paternal line, depending upon your sex. Haplogroups can be traced back to the genetic Adam and Eve, from which every human living is currently descended. Every now and then a mutation occurs, and every human descending from the first individual in which that mutation occurs will likely also have that mutation. The mutation can also be traced back to its source, meaning that you can find out how long ago it first occurred in any given population group. Overall, this means that groups of people with the same haplogroups are likely, but not necessarily, more strongly related to each other than people with dissimilar haplogroups. Native Americans have the haplogroups A2, B2, C1, D1, and X2A. Haplogroups A2 to D1 are found commonly in Northeast Asia, supporting the theory of a Northeast Asian origin of the Paleo-Americans. The question raised by the adherents of the Solutrean Hypothesis, amongst others, is where haplogroup X2A came from. One of the ideas raised was that X2A came from an independent migration from Europe across the Atlantic. However, it was found that all Native American haplogroups, including X2A, were present in a single group of Paleo-American founders, quashing the idea of a separate migration. Researchers also pointed out that X2A was not the only haplogroup present in Native America that was incredibly rare in modern-day Siberia, and that a stronger explanation for this than an Atlantic crossing was that the haplogroups had been rare but present in the founding group of Paleo-Americans who crossed into the Americas, but had since died out in Siberia. All of this pointed to Native Americans being more strongly related to East Asians than to any European populations, representing a strong argument that Native Americans did in fact come to the Americas from East Asia, not from Europe, and there are stronger theories that take this into account. For example, Part 3. The Coastal Migration Hypothesis. In 2016, a study by a number of Danish, Canadian, and American scientists raised a problem with the ice-free corridor hypothesis of Paleo-American migration. Although there had been a 930-mile-long corridor leading from Burundian down to the south, humans need to eat things, and it turned out that the entire corridor was absent of any form of ecosystem until about 12,600 years ago, meaning that unless the Paleo-Americans were able to go without food for months whilst also marching faster than the Imperial Roman army, not even the Clovis people could have used it. And yet, Paleo-Americans had entered America at least 2,000 years beforehand. They had to have gotten there somehow, and archaeologists thought they already had an idea of how. Enter the coastal migration hypothesis. In 1979, a scientist called Knut Fladmark suggested that the Paleo-Americans could have reached the Americas not by the use of the ice-free corridor, but by travelling by water from Burundian to North, Central, and South America along the western coastlines. For a long time, Fladmark's theory was largely disregarded as unlikely if not unnecessary, but with the growing unlikelihood of migration by ice-free corridor, it suddenly received a lot more attention. Archaeologists already knew about coastal sites of Paleo-American occupation, but now they were exploring them in more detail. One village on Triquet Island off the coast of British Columbia was revealed to have been inhabited, on and off, for 14,000 years. Increasingly, it began to look likely that the Paleo-Americans actually had migrated along a coastal kelp highway, a line of productive kelp forests from Northeast Asia to California, allowing them to quickly spread along the west coast of the Americas, explaining the early settlement of Monteverde. The idea that a group had gone inland from the coast and ended up following bison to the south of North America was used to explain Clovis in the absence of the ice-free corridor. The ocean migration theory overall seemed to be the best substitute available. However, there were still some questions that needed answers, and scientists weren't done with their theorizing yet. Part 4. The Burundian Stansel Hypothesis. In 2007, a study by a number of European and North and South American scientists put forward the idea of a Burundian standstill. The idea was that the ancestors of the Native Americans paused in Burundia for a time, becoming isolated for long enough to become genetically distinct from the Siberian population before moving into the Americas. The 2007 scientists put forward two possible scenarios. Firstly, there was the Burundian incubation model. This suggested that the ancestors of Native Americans populated Burundia before the last glacial maximum, and the creation of ecological and physical barriers, like glaciers, isolated them until they were able to enter the Americas 15,000 years ago. Then there was the direct colonization model, which suggested that the Paleo-Americans did not reach Burundia until just before 15,000 years ago, after which they moved continuously on into the Americas, being recently derived from a larger parent Asian population. The first model predicted that Native Americans would possess haplotypes specific to them that weren't found in Asia due to their having developed whilst they were isolated in Burundia, and this is what the researchers found. Three subclades, which are subgroups of haplogroups, C1b, C1c, and C1d, were found in nearly all Native Americans, and all three were completely absent in Asia, meaning that Native Americans likely all came from one group of founders who crossed into the Americas at the same time after a long period of isolation. The researchers also found a different subclade, C1a, in Asia, suggesting that some members of the same founding population had crossed back into Asia from Burundia rather than on into the Americas. On top of this, Inuits appear to have also migrated into North America separately and later than the Native American founders, due to their possessing the different subclade D2a. The scientists also found that the Paleo-Americans would have rapidly populated the Americas, suggesting an ocean route alongside the coast rather than a land-based route through an ice-free corridor. Part 5. Where are we today? As of 2019, scientists and archaeologists tend to be leaning towards the theory of an early Paleo-American isolation lasting thousands of years, allowing for the 5,000 or so years it would take for the necessary genetic mutation to happen, followed by a Pacific coast migration, although there is no true consensus. The timeline sounds something like this. No earlier than 23,000 years ago, the ancestors of Native Americans crossed into Burundian, becoming isolated due to the formation of ecological barriers preventing them from crossing into America proper or back into Siberia. Over the course of no more than 8,000 years, the isolated population evolved through adaptation to the cold and general mutation to have wider bodies and a dental configuration unique to Native Americans called supercynodont. About 17,000 years ago, early deglaciation occurred, causing the opening up of a route along the continental shelf of the Northeast Pacific, which was habitable and therefore navigable by 16,300 years ago. At some point between 16,000 and 14,000 years ago, Paleo-Americans followed the route along the Pacific coast, swiftly peopling North, Central, and South America, allowing them to get quickly to Monteverde, where a settlement was formed over 14,500 years ago. Then they travelled north to populate the Clovis area 13,000 years ago. Between 14,000 to 12,600 years ago, the isolation of local Paleo-American groups resulted in a split into two separate communities. The first group including the Northern Athabascans and Northern Amerindian groups, and the second including southern communities from southern North America, Central and South America. These peoples eventually became the group we now call Native Americans, underwent two Neolithic revolutions, and fully realized the concept of zero before anyone else, but that's a story for another time. So what do you think? Were the Paleo-American seafarers who populated the land from the coast, or do you prefer another theory? Remember to comment your thoughts down below and like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.